All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another workshop. Today, we're going to be exploring healing creativity, specifically how to plan without doing that. All right, and welcome again. If you missed it, story planning without killing creativity. So, this is something that I think a lot of writers struggle with when it comes to our work. Planning can feel very restrictive, and creativity we expect is to always feel free. But the truth is, structure and imagination, they don't have to compete, they can work together. And so today we are going to explore that. However, before we go any further, in the event that we do have any new persons on the workshop today, we're going to talk a little bit about me. Hi, everyone. I am NL Writemore. That is a pen name. I'm an author, a reader, a Caribbean girly. I'm also the sponsor for House Phoenix. Greetings. I'm a Caribbean girly, so if you hear the accent, that is where it is coming from. All right. Without further ado, let us jump right into it. So here is our roadmap for today. We are going to discuss why, as writers, we resist planning, how structure can actually support our creativity or the creative process, what quote unquote bad or poor planning looks like, some flexible planning methods that persons can use, and how best to navigate these methods. Following that, I will have a little section where you guys are free to ask any more questions that you might have. So let's jump right in. Why do we resist planning? There are quite a few reasons. However, we're going to be looking at four today. And the first one up is the fear of losing autonomy. Now, if you are big on theorists, then DC and Ryan have a self determination theory. And it talks about how persons are motivated and engaged when we feel we have autonomy, competence, choice. Now, creativity is often emotionally tied to freedom and self expression. So, when planning begins to feel too rigid or predetermined, a lot of us subconsciously interpret it as a loss of that creative freedom. And that resistance now is less about the structure of the planning itself and more about the fear of losing control over your creative process. So, in a nutshell, if planning starts to feel restrictive, your brain starts treating it like pressure instead of creativity. And so, persons tend to steer away from planning. Secondly, we have cognitive overload and decision fatigue. Once again, big on theory. You'll come to learn that I am big on theory. So we have John Sweller, and he does have the cognitive load theory. And it talks about the limited capacity that our brain has for processing a lot of information at one time. And when you're planning a story, it often requires simultaneous decisions about your plot, your pacing, world building, character arcs, themes. And then, whenever we have too many major decisions happening at once, our brain tends to get mentally overloaded and we begin to feel stuck. And this is all before we even begin drafting. So that's reason number two why we resist planning. Sometimes we avoid it because your brain already feels exhausted before we even start the story. The third one is identity and discovery writing. Now, this one is based on the narrative identity theory. And if you were a part of my workshop earlier, within the last couple of weeks, we did talk a little bit about this theory by Dan McAdams, where we mentioned that a lot of us, we build our sense of self through our stories. And when we plan apologies, it really takes away a lot of the intuitiveness or the spontaneity that comes with our character or persons who identify as being spontaneous or a discovery writer. And because of that, planning can feel like a threat to their creative process rather than just a different method of being creative. And so resistance becomes emotional now because we have attached a personal meaning to the process. And our final reason here is negative reinforcement from past experiences. In a nutshell, this is you have tried planning before and you didn't like it, you felt pressure, something went wrong, and because of that, now our brain tends to associate planning with stress or creative shutdown. And over time, we grow and we learn to avoid it, not because it actually never works, but because the past experience created frustration. So when we resist planning as writers, it's not usually laziness or a lack of discipline. It's in total a fear of restriction, mental overload, ties to our own identity, and of course, just previous negative experiences, which means the solution isn't forcing more structure on ourselves, but rather learning how to use the structures differently. And so now we are going to get into how structure can actually support your creativity. And I have all 5 reasons on the screen here. Of course, there are so many more reasons why, but we will jump into number one. It does reduce decision fatigue. So, writing already requires constant creativity and problem solving. And sometimes, without structure, as writers, we have to repeatedly stop and ask ourselves, what happens next? Does this scene matter? Where is this line supposed to go? Where is this plot leading? Now, when we already have a structure or we put some structure in place, it reduces the unnecessary decisions and we can focus a lot more of our mental energy into our dialogue, the emotions in the story, the imagery, character development. So structure doesn't remove creativity. There are times when it can protect your creative energy. Secondly, sometimes constraints can improve your creativity. Now, creativity does not always need to be free for all. I'm sure, let's use an example. Have you ever been to a buffet and they have a myriad of food choices and suddenly you don't know what you want to eat or you're no longer hungry? Think of having no limits, no structure like that. The world is your canvas and suddenly you don't know where to go. So structure helps with that. And a perfect example of how structure actually helps with that is the reason why we have genres. Imagine if every writer's book that you took up had every single genre you could think of in the book. It would be a little bit chaotic, right? So genres are actually structure. You're choosing something and you're working within that box. Similarly, we have writing prompts. Those kind of guide the writing process. They help you produce creative work, but it is within limits. Now, creativity often works better with direction rather than endless possibilities. Now, structure also helps your ideas to become stories. Having a good idea is not the same as sustaining a narrative. Structure helps you to organize tension, pacing, emotional development, progression, right? So, Robert McGee, if you know him rather, and other story theorists emphasize that structure creates meaning and emotional payoff. Without progression, stories often lose momentum in the middle. So, there you go. Fourth, structure supports emotional arcs. Strong stories are not just a sequence of events, they are emotional transformations. And structure helps us as writers to track the character's desire, what conflicts we want, what changes we need to see happening, what consequences should happen as a result of. So, planning emotional movement helps scenes to feel more purposeful instead of random. So structure helps us as writers to understand not just what happens, but why it matters. Not just to us as the writer, but to the character and also to the readers. Finally, we have structure increases follow through. Now, one major reasons why, as writers, we abandon our stories is loss of direction. When the next step is unclear or motivation drops. Now, productivity research consistently shows that clear next actions improve follow through and completion rates. Even loose planning gives the brain a roadmap to return to. So, structure can help us as writers to keep moving even when inspiration disappears. With that being said, structure isn't the opposite of creativity, clearly. It's often what allows creativity to survive long enough to become a finished story. Now, the problem starts when structure stops being support and starts becoming control. And so we are going to get into how do we identify when it is that structure is killing our creativity or killing the creative process. There are 5 reasons or 5 points that we're going to be looking at today. The first one is over planning everything too early. Now, sometimes as writers, when we're trying to plan, we try to solve every story problem before the draft begins. Every scene, every plot twist, conversation, and detail, we try to map it out immediately. For some writers, this removes a sense of discovery and emotional momentum during drafting. And as mentioned earlier, your brain can begin to feel overwhelmed, or your brain can begin to feel like the creative work is already done before the actual writing starts. So, whenever you feel as though you have completed the book just through your planning and you are stuck within that realm, then we might have a problem with over planning. So, planning should create direction, it should never drain your excitement. Secondly, treating that plan like a contract. You're not married to your plan. Outlines are there to guide you, not to control your story completely. For some of us as writers, we become afraid to change the ideas once we've planned them. And this is where the rigidity and the pressure comes from instead of having that flexibility that not planning seems to offer. So, a strong creative process often evolves during drafting because better ideas appear while writing. So, if you ever feel as though you have come up with a plan and you cannot stray from it, then please don't trap yourself. That is a trap, and that is why sometimes planning can feel as though it is killing your creative process. The third one that we are going to look at is perfectionism disguised as preparation. Pulling from our first point, sometimes excessive planning that we did, so that over planning, we use it now as a form of avoidance. We use it as a reason to stay in the planning phase because actually starting to write can sometimes feel scary. Planning might feel safer than actually writing a bad scene or an imperfect scene. So at some point, planning stops helping and starts delaying the actual work because we're trying to over prepare to avoid the discomfort of possible failure or criticism. So, whenever you feel as though you have to plan to avoid critique or you have to plan to avoid having a bad scene, then that is usually when you are misusing the planning method. Then we have 4, planning without emotional direction. Some outlines, when we're writing them as writers, they focus heavily on events, but not emotional movement. And so the story becomes then this happens, and we don't understand or we don't take the time out to understand why the character should care, how the conflict should change them, what emotional tension is being built here. So our stories, of course, need emotional progression, not just plot progression. And so whenever you feel as though your plan has taken away the emotional direction, then you are misusing the planning method. So your readers are supposed to be able to connect with the emotional movement of your story, not just the events. And finally, Whenever you find yourself using someone else's process without adapting it or tailoring it to yourself, then that is where we have some poor planning going on. For many of us as writers, we try to force ourselves into systems that don't always fit how we naturally think or how we naturally create. So, what worked for me as a writer, it might overwhelm someone else, and what works for someone else might overwhelm me or might underwhelm me. So, some of us as writers, we thrive with detailed outlines. Others work better with loose story anchors and discovery drafting. The goal is not to copy someone else's process. It is to build one that supports you, your creativity, and helps you to maintain consistency. So the best planning system is the one that keeps you writing. So the issue is not structure itself. It's a rigid structure. It's not it's pressure. It's actually using planning in a way that helps you to write and leaves all the room for creativity. And how do we do that? How do we plan in a way that leaves room for creativity? Well, we're going to talk about it. So we are going to look at four. Oh, wait, too far ahead. We're going to look at.
Right, Mar, I'm just going to pause you for 1 second. If anyone else watching is having issues with the video, I'm screenshotting what she's putting and sticking it in the chat. There's a few people that the video's just they're hearing you, but they're not seeing the pictures. So I'm just trying to do a workaround. I just want to let people know to look at the chat.
Thank you. All right. So continuing on. So there are four planning methods that we're going to look at today. The first three are the more commonly known ones, and then we have that fourth one there that we will also talk about. So the first one is the plotter. Now, plotters prefer structure before drafting begins, and as a plotter, we tend to often outline major beats, character arcs, world building, ending, and of course, this does have its pros. So, planning helps to reduce uncertainty and keeps your story organized. And as plotters, we tend to feel more confident when we know where the story is going. Some of the pros for using the plotting method is it allows for strong structure and pacing. It makes it easier when revision needs to be done, and it lowers your chance of having plot holes. Of course, it does come with some drawbacks. The plotter method does require you to be very detailed, and so it can become overly rigid, or you might find yourself losing a little bit of excitement whenever you get into over planning. No, don't be dismayed. The plotter method is definitely something that persons can use, and one of the more popular authors that uses the plotter method is J.K. Rowling. If you know J.K. Rowling's writing, then you need not be dismayed. It's very much possible to plan, and still produce really great work. All right. Secondly, we have the pantser. These are persons that are writing off the top of your head, writing literally by the seat of your pants. So as you go along, that's how your story is coming up. So you may begin with a concept, a character, a scene, or an emotional idea, but everything else is based on spontaneity and is a part of your creative excitement. And so persons who use this method, and yes, it is actually a method, guys, often enjoy being surprised by the story as it develops. It comes with a few strengths, of course. So you have a lot of high emotional spontaneity, a strong sense of discovery, and that's for the writer. And the character development tends to feel more organic. Of course, there are drawbacks. You can lose direction midway, and there is a higher risk of unfinished drafts or heavy revisions if you don't have a direction for the work in progress. Now, That does not mean it's not possible. Stephen King is a testament of this. He uses that method. So discovery writing is what he prefers. And then we have the planter. This is literally a hybrid. It is the plotter and the pantser having a baby together. So they do have some planning going on. So, for example, they might plan major story beats, or they might plan emotional arcs, or they might just plan the ending direction that they want their novel to have. But they do leave room for discovery during the drafting process. And so this method tends to balance organization with creative flexibility. So, and that's one of the strengths of this method: balance, structure, and freedom. It is easier in terms of adaptability when you're drafting, and it often reduces both overwhelm and rigidity. There are a few drawbacks. It can drift too far toward chaos or over control if you're not careful. And it does require a lot of flexibility and self awareness to know when you are going off the edge. Now, if you know Neil Gaiman, then that author is someone that uses the planter method. So the planter method helps you to build a roadmap but still explore the terrain. And finally, a less commonly discussed one but very useful is the modular planner. Now, modular planners build stories in pieces instead of a linear line. So they may create disconnected scenes or conversation moments, dialogue moments. They may create emotional beats. They may create some character interactions. And then later they sit and they organize and connect them into a full narrative. And this works very well for writers who think visually or emotionally before structurally. This method encourages creative exploration, and it's a very good method if your story is character heavy, or if you're a character heavy writer. And then this reduces also the pressure that we need to write in order. So you don't always need to write chapter 1, then chapter 2, then chapter 3. This method allows you to be just a little bit chaotic, but still on time. Of course, it does require strong revision and organization later in terms of having to sit and piece everything together. But nonetheless, it is possible. And Quentin is a very good example of that. While he's not an author, he is a screenwriter, and his scripts have been very good. And so, as we close out from this, it's important to note that not every story has to be built in order to be built well. And your goal isn't supposed to be choosing the best method at face value, but rather it's to help yourself understand which process is going to help you to stay creative, consistent, and capable of finishing your story. All right. Now, how do we navigate these planning methods? It starts by understanding that there is no correct planning style. There is no one set planning style that is foolproof and will work for everyone, as I mentioned earlier. As writers, we all process our stories differently. As mentioned, some of us need structure before drafting, some of us need discovery before drafting, during drafting, after drafting. And so the ones that I mentioned are just common approaches. They are not set in stone, and truthfully, a lot of writers navigate or move between methods depending on the project or where they are at in the project. Your process, whatever it may be, should support your creativity, not fight it. Secondly, plan your anchors, not every detail. So instead of planning every scene, focus on major story anchors. So beginning, major turning points, climax, emotional arcs. This can create direction while still leaving room for spontaneity during the drafting process. And many professional writers use loose framework instead of rigid scene by scene outlines. Right? You don't need to know every step to know where the story is going. Also, try to leave intentional gaps. Not every question needs to be answered. Leave space for discovery and keep your writing process alive emotionally. Curiosity can become a part of the drafting momentum, and a lot of times we are curious ourselves to know where we are going to take the next scene. Flexible planning should allow you as a writer to explore better ideas that appear naturally while you're writing. Revise your plan as the story evolves. Your planning, as I said, you should not be married to it. It should be adaptable. Your characters may develop differently during the drafting phase, or you might input new emotional layers, or some new conflicts may appear unexpectedly based on what you're writing. So never be afraid to revise your outline. Revising your outline is not failure, it is 100% a part of the creative process. Focus on emotional direction, not just the plot. So instead of only asking what happens next, also try and ask yourself what changes emotionally. What does the character learn, lose, or realize? Emotional direction helps scenes to feel more purposeful and connected. Plan your scenes around questions, not answers. So instead of scripting every moment, plan around dramatic questions. Will they forgive each other? What secret gets exposed? What choice changes everything? This keeps your tension and curiosity alive, and it keeps it alive for both you as the writer and your audience. It also allows your scene to develop more naturally during the drafting process instead of feeling mechanically pre-written. And finally, separate your drafting from editing. Many of us as writers, we lose momentum because we try to plan, draft, edit perfect all at the same time. Flexible planning works best when drafting is allowed to be exploratory first, and then editing and refining can happen later. Your first draft will probably not be your last draft. It will not be the finished work. And creativity flows better when every stage of the writing process isn't happening all at once. Finally, use the structure as support, not pressure. The goal of planning is not to achieve perfection. It is to provide you with some clarity, momentum, and a little bit of consistency. Good structure should reduce stress, not create it. Any planning method that you use, it should help you as a writer return to your story and not fear it. Planning should ensure that you feel comfortable, you feel confident, you feel as though your writing is manageable, and you should not be intimidated. All right. Now, as we close out, can anybody, by looking at the screen, guess the method?
Mav says plotter. Serena said not pants. Dan says looks like plotter to me. Mav says it's Ryan.
So this is yes. The ones that said plotter, you guys are correct. This is a template that a plotter would use. This is actually a template that I created. So this is a template that I use for for all of my works in progress. So I will share the template in the Library of Alexandria if anyone is interested in using it. I will drop it there. But yes, this is the plotter method. So we're at that section where I will take any questions that you guys may have or anything you would like to add in.
Ryan posted his example of plotting. Uh, Dan said, I also have a template, but it's not quite as long as these, so it might be a plancer. Me too, Dan.
And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're a planter, I think you should go ahead and drop your template in the Library of Alexandria as well. Maybe what I will do is I'll create a thing, and then whatever you think your planning method is, if you have a template, we can all just drop it there and persons can pick, choose, and refuse.
I think that's a great idea. Beckett says, thanks, Writemore.
You're welcome.
You're getting thanked because she says thank you. They're all very excited about the templates. HK says thank you. Beckett says, I'm a pantser and I thought that's wrong. Oh, there's a question. CJ says, what happens when you outline and plot, then after writing the draft, you veer off?
Then, if you veer off from your plan, it's probably a good idea for you to take a step back and look at it to understand if your veering off is beneficial to your storyline or if it is something that you need to revisit and stick to your storyline line. It just depends on if you want to change the direction of your story or if whatever veering off is going to add to your story.
Uh, I'm going to say this wrong. Neorella says thank you, and Serena says wonderful presentation. Olive said thank you. Oh, Dan says, I do think that I may have strayed too far away in my planning recently, and I may be losing sight of the character arcs and why it matters emotionally and focusing too much on the plot and plot holes.
So it's a very good idea for you, Dan, to revisit those big questions. So you need to revisit, let me find the word here, the whys. Where is it that you want this interaction to lead? What is the development you want your character to go through? What is the emotions you want them to be feeling? And not just that, how is it going to be beneficial to your storyline?
Okay. There's a lot of people typing. We'll take a couple more questions, and then I think we will close it out for Morio. Um, Rad Dan said, thank you. I agree. I think that's what I need to do. I think I'm in my own head a bit too much, and I really need to feel the characters more. Rad Geek says, so those of us doing sci-fi and fantasy might have extensive notes beside these about world building.
My template does have a section for your world lore and all of that. The snippet is does not do it justice, but I will provide the detailed template there for you, and you should be good if you want to use.
Okay. Mav says, awesome work, y'all. Thank you and appreciate me. You're welcome. um, okay. Just going to give one more second, see if there's any more actually questions. Narella said, I tended to veer off from my outline if I feel this will change the story for the better. Outline
Yeah.
helps me establish the ideas in progress. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Okay. I look forward to seeing everybody's templates.
I do
Yeah.
too. I do too.
Yeah. Thank you, Writemore. That was awesome. I really enjoyed that.